The line for business class shimmered under sterile lights, but all eyes locked on the girl who didn't look like she belonged. The business class check-in line gleamed under the kind of overhead lights that made everything feel too clean, too bright, too certain. Ava Ford stood near the velvet rope, her black duffel slipping slightly from her shoulder. She adjusted it without thinking, her hoodie sleeves tugged halfway over her hands. The sweatshirt wasn't branded, no college logo, just plain gray, frayed a little at the cuffs. The line moved, not fast, not slow, just the kind of pace where no one really looked at anyone else unless something was off. She stepped forward. A woman behind the counter, mid-30s, sleek bun, name tag slightly crooked, barely glanced up before her gaze snagged on Ava, paused, then narrowed. Boarding pass. The tone wasn't rude, not exactly, but there was something under it, something amused. Ava handed over her ticket and ID. No smile, no apology. Just the kind of quiet you learn from watching too much go wrong in rooms where you were supposed to belong. The woman, Tina, according to the plastic badge, didn't take the ID right away. She tilted her head, squinted like she was reading a suspicious prescription label. "This is for business class." "Yes." A beat passed. Tina chuckled softly, the kind that didn't need to be loud to draw attention. Flying solo with a last name like Ford. She flipped the ID, eyebrows lifting. As in, Harrison. Ava didn't flinch. "Yes." Another pause. Then the smirk widened. "Let me guess. Your grandpa gave you a spaceship for your 16th birthday. It wasn't funny, but a man 2 lanes over chuckled anyway." Ava said nothing. "Okay, okay," Tina laughed, eyes still locked on the ID. "Come on, though. This doesn't even look real." "It is," Ava said, calm, careful. Tina leaned in a little. "You know, pretending to be someone you're not is a federal offense. Right? I'm not pretending." Something tightened in Ava's voice so slight, you might miss it unless you were listening for cracks. Tina scanned the ticket. It beeped. Green. Cleared. But the pause lingered anyway. "And who booked it?" "My grandfather." "Sure he did." Tina leaned back, arms folded now. "You do know Harrison Ford isn't the name you just toss around in an airport, right? It sets off expectations." Ava stared. Still, steady. More heads had turned now, whispering, low and fast. A guy near the rope line leaned into someone next to him. "That her?" "She say Ford." Tina's smile returned. Colder now. "Why don't you step over there for a moment? I'm going to have someone double check." "Why?" Ava asked. Tina's voice dipped into something syrupy. "Because, sweetheart, you don't look like you belong here." Ava blinked, just once, then said, quietly, "That says more about you than me." But the crack had already started. Not in her, not yet, in the way people were beginning to look at her, like maybe she was the story. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The pause stretched too long. Ava stood still, feet planted just inside the red circle someone had taped on the floor, some kind of visual cue, maybe for strollers or VIPs. Either way, it felt like a trap now. Tina had vanished behind the desk for only a moment, long enough to tap something, whisper something. Then she reappeared, chin lifted like she was waiting for applause. 2 men in black TSA jackets approached from the left aisle. Not rushed, not uncertain, just casual in the way people are when they already believe something about you. "Random screening," one of them said, without even introducing himself. Ava turned slightly. "I already cleared TSA. New alert just came through," the taller one replied, eyes hidden behind mirrored lenses. "It happens. But it didn't happen like this." She knew that, and so did they. The other agent, younger, chewing gum too fast, motioned to a narrow side table beneath a flickering light. Bag up here? She hesitated, just enough for Tina to speak up again, loud enough for the line to hear. Look, I don't want to assume anything, but it's a little weird, right? That name, that ticket, that hoodie, a ripple of laughter somewhere behind her. Small, awkward. Someone coughed into their sleeve. Ava stepped forward. The duffel thudded on the table. The young agent Marquez. The name tag read, unzipped it fast, almost like he was hoping something illegal would leap out. He pulled things free without looking. Sweatshirt, gloves, a folded backup shirt, then something smaller, a cloth bundle, tucked tightly against the side panel. He reached for it. Ava's voice cracked through the noise, not loud but sharp. Careful. He didn't stop. The cloth unwrapped slowly, layers loosening like something sacred being undone by someone who didn't know better. Inside was a small, white compass, the kind with a brass rim and dark blue dial, cracked slightly on one side. Marquez held it up between two fingers. What's this? She swallowed. It was my father's. He turned it once. Sentimental. Yes. He turned it again and dropped it. It didn't fall hard, but it bounced once, twice, and rolled off the edge of the table, catching the tile at just the wrong angle. Tick, crack, a quiet sound, almost gentle, but it landed louder than anything else in the terminal. Ava didn't move at first. Neither did the agents. Then she stepped forward, hands already trembling. She knelt without thinking, gathering the pieces. One shard caught her thumb. Blood bloomed fast, bright. She's bleeding, someone whispered. She dropped something weird. Someone else replied. She said it was her dad's, came another voice, like that mattered less. Tina, arms folded, called out from behind the counter. You sure that isn't part of the act? Ava didn't answer. She just held the largest piece in her hand, the one that still held the faded engraving on the back to Ava. So you never feel lost. She stood, quiet, with blood running down her palm. And in that moment, no one, not a single person, asked if she was okay. The compass hadn't shattered, not in the way people expected things to break. No dramatic burst, no sharp sound to jolt anyone into action. Just a crack, thin, precise, like the world was drawing a quiet line through something sacred. Ava stood holding it, the largest piece still warm from where it had rested in her bag all morning. The engraving was only half visible now, the rest curled around a missing edge. She didn't cry. Not yet. Her thumb throbbed, blood lining the crease where the shard had kissed her skin. She pressed her other hand around it, not to stop the bleeding exactly, but more like hiding it. Marquez cleared his throat. You okay? He asked, more to fill the silence than out of concern. Ava didn't answer. The other agent Donahue crouched beside the table, collecting the rest of her belongings like he was bagging evidence. A protein bar, a notebook with block letter sketches, a pair of socks, her earbuds, tangled in themselves. He didn't touch the compass. Marquez shifted his weight, trying not to look guilty, which somehow made it worse. She said that thing was from her dad. Someone whispered from behind the stanchion line. Tina's voice rose over the murmur. Can we move this along? I've got 5 business execs behind her who actually paid for their tickets. Ava's fingers clenched tighter around the shard. Blood smeared faintly across the napkin she had used to cradle it. Then the questions began again. Where did you get this ticket? Who booked it? Are you traveling alone? She answered once. My grandfather. But that wasn't enough anymore. The screen behind the counter flickered. Tina typed something fast, her nails clacking against the keys like punctuation marks on suspicion. Ava shifted slightly, and something else fell from the open bag, her sketchbook. It slid across the table and stopped against Marquez's hip. He picked it up. Workout plans, he muttered, flipping through the pages, or coded drop points. He grinned at Donahue, like he'd made a joke worth sharing. Donahue didn't laugh, but someone behind Ava did. A teenage boy, maybe 16. Too loud, too curious. Maybe she's just lost, he said, not cruelly, just loud enough to sting. Ava closed her eyes, and for a second, she wasn't in the airport. She was somewhere else entirely, a driveway. Years ago, holding that same compass in both hands as her father kneeled beside her. If you ever feel like the world forgets who you are, he had whispered, just hold this. It always knows where home is. She opened her eyes. The world had forgotten. Or maybe it had never cared to learn in the first place. A small laugh rose from Tina again. Seriously, this is the girl claiming to be Ford's granddaughter? Ava stepped back from the table, her hands still bleeding, her compass broken, her name floating somewhere in the air, like it no longer belonged to her. She was still bleeding when the new voice arrived. It didn't shout. It didn't rush. It just appeared. Miss Ford. The speaker was tall, impeccably dressed, smooth blazer, subtle tie clip, shoes that had never touched rain, the kind of man who didn't ask questions unless he already knew the answers or was very confident the ones you gave wouldn't matter. Ava turned slowly, her shoulders square, her hand still cupped the broken compass inside a balled-up napkin. I'm Charles, Terminal Services. His smile was pleasant, rehearsed. Mind if I take a moment of your time? He was already taking it. Ava nodded once. Charles glanced briefly at her open duffel, the scattered contents, the quiet gathering of strangers pretending not to watch. I understand you're claiming to be traveling under a business class ticket, not claiming, she said. I am. Of course, he replied, still smiling. The thing is, the system flagged your reservation. Third-party vendor, unverified card, no profile, no frequent flyer account, no return flight. He paused like he was giving her a moment to offer some miracle context. It raises questions. My grandfather booked it, she said again. She was tired of repeating that sentence. It tasted old. He nodded, gently. And who is your grandfather? Miss Ford. She hesitated. Harrison Ford. That was it. The pause after was longer than it should have been. Charles didn't blink. He didn't laugh, either. Just gave another one of those subtle nods. The kind that meant noted, dismissed. He tapped on his tablet. So here's where we are. Your boarding is temporarily paused. We need to verify the legitimacy of the purchase, given the profile mismatch. Ava stared at him. You're canceling my flight. No, not canceling. Pausing. For safety and verification purposes, you understand celebrity aliases, false bookings, it's a known tactic. And what am I supposed to do in the meantime? We have a holding zone. It's clean, secure, near baggage claim. You can wait there while we sort everything. I didn't lie, she said, her voice low, not trembling, just small. Of course. Charles smiled again. That smile that meant this conversation is over, but not really. He turned to one of the agents. Escort her. Please. Ava opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her eyes flicked to the compass in her hand, then to the shattered silence on the floor behind her. No one had bothered to pick up the smaller pieces. Not even her. A hand touched her elbow. Let's go, miss. She looked down, then up, then finally let herself move. The last thing she heard before stepping away from the check-in line wasn't Charles or Tina or the guards. It was a woman, behind the stanchion ropes, whispering to her son, if she really was Ford's granddaughter, they wouldn't treat her like this. The holding area wasn't really a room, just a forgotten corner near the baggage claim white tile, gray bench bolted to the floor, and overhead lights that hummed like they were tired of themselves. Ava sat alone, elbows on her knees, hands wrapped around each other. The napkin in her palm was stained part blood, part dust from the floor. Inside it, the compass shard pressed gently into her skin like it still had something to say. She didn't unwrap it. Not yet. A loudspeaker crackled. Flight numbers. Gate changes. None of them hers. She checked the time on her phone, not because she had anywhere to be, but because silence always felt heavier when measured. 14 minutes had passed. 14 minutes since Charles had nodded, since the crowd had turned their heads away, since Tina, with all her polished sarcasm, had moved on to the next guest, as if Ava had never existed at all. She thought, for a moment, about doing nothing, just waiting, letting them sort it out. Maybe someone would eventually believe her. Maybe they'd call the number on the ID and realize it wasn't fake. But the thought cracked in her mind the same way the compass had. They didn't believe her because they didn't want to. And that wasn't going to fix itself. She unlocked her phone. The top of her favorites list hadn't changed since last year. Just one name. Gramps. Her finger hovered over it. Just call him. No. Wait. What if he couldn't come? What if he was filming, or out on a trail, or somewhere too far for this kind of mess? What if she tapped the name? It rang once, then twice. He picked up. Hey, kid. His voice was exactly as she remembered it, weathered but warm, like gravel that had been worn smooth by time. She didn't speak right away. Ava, that pause, that shift. He always knew when something was off. They said I lied. She said quietly. Who did the airport people? They said the ticket's fake, that the name wasn't mine. They tore my stuff open. They broke the compass. The last part came out smaller than she wanted, like it had cracked her just saying it. He didn't say anything for a long second. Then where are you? Near the glass doors. Baggage claim. They told me to wait here, unless the person who booked it shows up. Another pause. This one, sharper. I want you to listen to me, Ford said. Every word sounded like it had been carved. Don't move. Don't talk to anyone else. Don't touch the bag. Just sit. Her eyes stung, but she blinked it away. They're not going to let you in without a pass, she whispered. They will. That was it. She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. Okay. The call ended. Her fingers stayed curled around the phone, even as the screen went dark. Outside the wide glass doors, people passed by, rolling suitcases, checking watches, living lives that didn't glance her way, and Ava, for now, just stayed still. But something had shifted. Someone was coming. The terminal doors didn't make a sound when they slid open. They never do. But something shifted anyway. Something low, like air pressure giving way to presence. People didn't look up right away. They almost never do. But heads turned eventually, not all at once. Just enough to feel like gravity had tilted. He stepped through in worn leather. Not the polished kind you wear to be seen. The kind that remembers storms. No entourage. No camera. Just a man whose silence entered the room before he did. Harrison Ford? Ava didn't see him at first. Her eyes had been locked on the floor, on the faint line of dried blood along her thumb. She was still holding the napkin, still curling her fingers around the compass shard like it might anchor her. But the shift in the room reached her too. She looked up, and there he was. He didn't rush. He never did. His stride was steady, measured the way a person walks when they're used to crossing into places where no one holds the door open. People didn't part for him. Not exactly. They just moved, slightly, as if their bodies knew something they hadn't yet admitted. He stopped in front of her. No words at first, just looked. She stood automatically. Her knees were stiff, her sleeves still stained. He looked at her hands, the one wrapped in napkin. The way she was trying not to show it still hurt. Then he looked at the bag on the bench, its zipper half opened like someone had tried to turn it inside out. His jaw tightened, barely. Still, no words, just breath. Then finally, you okay? It wasn't rhetorical. She nodded, almost. He didn't press, didn't reach for her, just let the space breathe. Behind him, a uniformed guard near the checkpoint straightened, whispered something into his mic. The message rippled, and then Charles was there. Terminal services, blazer now slightly askew, as if he'd hurried halfway and tried to smooth himself back into authority on the way. "Mr. Ford," he said, almost too quickly, "I am terribly sorry for the confusion. We were just following procedure, and there was an inconsistency with Ford didn't take the offered handshake, didn't even glance at it." He looked past Charles, at the desk where Tina was now half hunched over her keyboard, pretending to type, at Marquez fiddling with his gloves, at the table where Ava's things had been laid out like evidence. Then his eyes returned to Charles. "When did bleeding become part of your procedure?" The question landed like a dropped wrench in a silent garage. Charles opened his mouth, then closed it. A few phones came up, slowly, quietly. No one said a word. Ford turned slightly, just enough to see Ava in the corner of his vision. "You ready?" She nodded, but neither of them moved. Not yet. Because this wasn't done, and everyone in that terminal knew it. The silence didn't crack, it thickened, like smoke that wouldn't clear. Charles tried again. "Mr. Ford, I assure you," Ford raised a hand. Not aggressive, just final. A signal that didn't need a second part. "I asked a question," he said, voice low, controlled. "Which one of you made her bleed?" It wasn't shouted. He didn't need to. Tina looked up from her screen like she just remembered how to blink. Marquez straightened too quickly, almost dropped his gloves. Donahue glanced sideways at the security desk. No one answered. Was it procedure to break what her father left her? Ford asked again. His tone didn't rise, but something underneath it did, pressure maybe, or patience running thin. "She told you what it was," he continued. "Told you to be careful. You weren't..." Still, no one spoke. Ava stood behind him, a little straighter now, still quiet, but her arms were no longer wrapped around herself. Charles cleared his throat, words piling into the silence like furniture falling in a quiet house. It was unintentional. "Our agent, Marquez, was conducting a visual sweep, and the object was mishandled." Ford turned slightly. "Mishandled," he repeated. Marquez finally spoke. "It slipped." Ford looked at him. Really looked. "She picked it up like it mattered. Because it did. And none of you helped. Not one. No one argued. No one tried to." A few feet away, a boy who had laughed earlier slowly lowered his phone. A woman tugged gently on her son's sleeve. He didn't move. Ford exhaled once, then turned to Ava. His voice shifted, warmer, but still steady. "You still have it." She nodded, opened her hand just enough to show the napkin, folded and thin. The blood was darker now, dried. He looked at it, then at her. His eyes softened, just for a second. "She didn't come here asking for special treatment," he said, now facing the whole room. "She didn't throw her name around. She just stood where her ticket told her to stand." He paused. "You decided she didn't look like she belonged." No one moved. She didn't yell, didn't scream. She just bled, silently, while you all pretended it wasn't your problem. Charles's lips parted. A breath, not a sentence. Ford stepped closer. Not fast, just sure. "You humiliated her in front of strangers. Treated her like a mistake because you didn't believe the name matched the girl." Someone in the crowd whispered, "It's really him." Another, "That's his granddaughter." Ford didn't turn. He kept his eyes on the staff. "Next time you think silence is weakness, remember this." His gaze flicked to Ava again. "She didn't break. You did. And still, not a single person said they were sorry. But none of them dared speak again either." The ripple came late, like most apologies do. An elevator dinged open across the terminal. Suits poured out, clipboard whispers, someone pointing, and then a man with a regional director badge clipped too neatly to his breast pocket made his way forward. Brisk but overly cautious, like he was heading into a room where someone had already thrown a punch. He stopped just short of Ford. Mr. Ford, he said, hand extended, voice rehearsed for press conferences. I don't need your name. Ford cut in, still calm. I need your memory to work. The man hesitated, lowered his hand. Ford didn't flinch. She's my granddaughter, he said. You had her sitting on a plastic bench, bleeding, because a ticket looked too good for the girl holding it. The director nodded stiffly. I've been briefed. This situation was mishandled, grossly. We deeply regret. She doesn't need regret. Ford turned, gesturing gently toward Ava, who now stood at his side, sleeve still stained, hands still wrapped in the same napkin. She needed respect. He continued, 2 hours ago, before the damage. She has our full respect now, the man offered. Ford gave him a look. It wasn't anger, just the kind of gaze that lets silence finish the sentence for him. We've reinstated her boarding, the man added quickly, and we're prepared to offer a private suite and an upgrade first class. Priority lounge. Anything no, Ford said. The man blinked. She doesn't need an upgrade. Ford looked at Ava, then back to the director. She earned the seat you questioned, a few feet away. Charles adjusted his tie like it might strangle him if he didn't. Behind them, Tina had disappeared entirely. People were still watching, phones still recording, though more quietly now, like even the pixels understood they were in the presence of something that couldn't be clipped into 30 seconds. A child near the stanchion whispered, "She really is his granddaughter." Ford glanced toward the voice but didn't address it. Instead, he said, softer now, "You don't fix dignity by giving someone a better seat. You fix it by not tearing it down in the first place." The regional director opened his mouth, then closed it again. Ford looked back at Ava. You ready now? She nodded, slower this time. But before she turned, her eyes scanned the people who had watched her humiliation, recorded her silence, whispered when she didn't defend herself. And this time, they looked away first. Not because of who she was standing with, but because they finally believed who she'd been all along. No stage, no lights, no speeches, just the quiet weight of being seen. The plane had lifted 30 minutes ago. Outside the window, clouds pressed softly against the glass, as if trying to listen in. Inside, the cabin hummed white noise and citrus-scented air. Business class murmured behind them, but up front, it felt like stillness. Ava sat by the window, her hoodie sleeves pulled low. The napkin still rested in her lap, folded around what was left of the compass. She hadn't opened it again. Harrison Ford sat beside her, hands loose in his lap, legs still. He hadn't said much since takeoff. He didn't need to. Then, quietly, "Let me see." Ava hesitated, then slowly unwrapped the napkin, revealing the shard with the half-visible inscription. "So you never feel lost." The crack ran through the never. He took it gently, held it in both hands like he was remembering something else entirely. "Your father," he said after a pause, "used to carry this when he was your age. Said it wasn't for direction, it was for courage." Ava looked down. "I didn't know that." Ford nodded, still staring at the piece. "You were 5 when he gave it to you. Said it belonged with the bravest person in the house." She exhaled, soft. "I don't remember." "You don't have to." He looked over. "That's what legacy's for. To remember things you were too young to hold on your own." She blinked a few times, but didn't look away. He continued, "You know what else he used to say?" She shook her head. "Don't run from the fire. Run into it if someone's still inside." She swallowed. "There was this apartment downtown," Ford said, voice lower now. 10 years ago. 3rd floor. Fire department hadn't arrived yet. Your dad pulled out 2 elderly men, a mother and her son." He paused. He went back in for one more. Ava's breath caught. He didn't make it out. She'd heard pieces of that story before. Whispers, headlines, a box in the attic no one opened, but never like this. "I thought it was a building collapse," she murmured. "Wasn't." Ford's voice was steady, but quieter now. He knew the risk, still ran in. Why? Ford looked at her, eyes older than his face, because he couldn't stand the idea of someone being invisible. Ava turned toward the window, not to look out, just to breathe without being watched. After a moment, they made me feel like I wasn't real. He didn't respond right away. Then you know what he would have said to that. She waited. Ford turned slightly, the edge of a smile faint, real touching his voice. Then you remind them. Ava reached for the compass piece again, held it differently this time, not like it was broken, but like it still knew the way. The sky outside had begun to dim blue, fading toward ash, the first edge of dusk skimming the clouds. Inside the cabin, the light stayed low. Ava hadn't spoken in a while, not since the story, not since the truth of it settled into the space between them like something finally allowed to breathe. The compass shard was still in her hand. She hadn't tucked it away this time. It sat open on her palm, catching light every time the wing tilted against the sun. Ford leaned back in his seat, one hand resting near hers but not touching. I thought, she said, finally, if I stayed quiet, they'd believe me. He didn't answer right away. He just nodded, barely. They didn't care, she added. They didn't even ask. His voice was low when it came. You don't have to be loud to be right. She looked down. I let them take everything. My bag, my notebook, the compass, even my name. I didn't say it like I believed it. He turned toward her. You didn't let them take it, he said. You carried it through. She was quiet for a while after that, letting it settle, letting it sting less, then much softer. You didn't have to come. Ford tilted his head, didn't like the idea of you flying with blood on your hands. She smiled, small, crooked, but real. I'm sorry, she said, if I made things harder. No, he said. You weren't the trouble. You were in trouble. She sat with that, let it rewrite the story she'd been carrying. After a few beats, she spoke again. I know I'm not really. She hesitated. I mean, Dad was adopted. I'm not blood. Ford turned fully toward her. Don't finish that sentence. She blinked. His voice was steady, not sharp, but immovable. You're mine, he said. Not because of blood, because I chose you, because your dad chose you, and because I see him in you. Every stubborn, beautiful part. Ava looked away quickly, but not fast enough to hide the tear that slipped free. She didn't wipe it, didn't apologize. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a clean handkerchief, and placed it gently in her lap. She wrapped it around the shard without a word. A few rows back, a couple glanced forward. A child peeked over the seat, but Ava didn't notice. She looked at the shard in her hand, then at the man beside her, then out the window, where the sky had given up its color entirely. And then she said it, not loudly, not defiantly, just with certainty. I am Ford. He didn't smile right away, just nodded, then, quiet as the horizon. Damn right you are. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.